Your support keeps these stories alive. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell. When my dad was first admitted to the hospital, the days felt like they blurred together: long corridors, the faint smell of antiseptic, and the constant hum of machinery in the background. I had taken on the role of his unofficial advocate, making sure he was eating well, answering questions from doctors, and being there whenever a nurse needed a family member's input. After a few days in the main hospital unit, he was transferred to the rehab floor, which meant a slightly less intense pace but still plenty of oversight. The rehab unit had a family room, a simple space tucked away from the main patient hallways. It wasn't glamorous, just a few chairs, a large table in the middle, a smaller desk in the corner, and a TV mounted high on the wall. But to me, it was perfect. I could work remotely there during the day, headphones on, tapping away at my laptop without disturbing anyone. Most days, it was completely empty until visiting hours. Sometimes another family member would drop in for a coffee or to watch the news, and I'd tell them not to worry about making noise. My headphones drowned out everything. I liked that balance of solitude and quiet camaraderie. It quickly became my routine: arrive in the late morning, check on Dad, then settle into the small desk in the corner of the family room. I'd have my lunch there, do my work calls, and then after my shift, head back to Dad's room to spend the evening with him. The nurses seemed fine with it. A few even joked that I was part of the furniture now. That's why the moment with the three nurses caught me so off guard. One day, in the middle of typing an email, the door swung open and in they came. They weren't just passing through, they marched in with a purpose. The one in front, clearly the leader of the group, stopped abruptly and asked sharply, "What are you doing here? We want this room." I took off my headphones, smiled politely, and said, "Oh, I'm just working at this little desk here. I'm a family member. They told me I could use this space. Please feel free to use the table or any other spot." That didn't go over well. She frowned and said, "No, I want you to leave. We want the whole room." I blinked. "This is a shared space, right? I'm not in the way. You can do whatever you need to do. I won't bother you." But she wouldn't budge. She just stood there with her arms crossed, clearly expecting me to pack up my things. The two nurses behind her looked at the floor, clearly uncomfortable. Eventually, she huffed, muttered something under her breath, and left the room. The whole encounter left me with this sour taste in my mouth. I wasn't trying to be difficult, I just didn't see why I should be forced out of a space that had been described as open to all family members. But I also didn't want this turning into some ongoing power struggle with hospital staff. A few minutes later, another woman walked in. I later learned she was part of hospital administration. She glanced at my laptop and asked bluntly, "Why are you working here? The nurses said they need this room." I explained everything: how I'd been there every day for weeks, how I'd been told the family room was for family members, and how I was perfectly fine with sharing. She raised an eyebrow and asked, "Did you tell them you're a family member and not staff?" "Yes," I said, first thing I told them. Her expression shifted from skeptical to apologetic almost instantly. "You have first rights to this room. This is for you. The nurses should know better than to try to remove you. I'll go talk to them right now." I thanked her, though I added that I was still more than happy to share the space if they needed it for something specific. She gave me a reassuring smile, left, and I never saw those three nurses again for the remaining 2 weeks I was there. It seemed like a small victory, but it was more than that. It was about not being made to feel like an intruder in a space meant for people like me, people sitting by loved ones in hospital beds, juggling life, work, and worry all at once. The rehab unit had its own rhythm, different from the main hospital ward. The days were quieter, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that settled over people when they were in transition, trying to recover, adjust, and get back to something resembling a normal life. The hallways were wide, polished, and smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with the scent of whatever was on the lunch menu. Every morning, I'd pass a few patients shuffling with walkers, guided by therapists who encouraged them with soft but firm voices. "Just one more step, you can do it." My dad's room was near the middle of the unit, close enough to the nurse's station that I could hear snippets of their conversations when I visited. He had a roommate, an older man recovering from a hip surgery, who had a booming voice and a love for daytime TV game shows. They got along fine, but there were moments when Dad would quietly motion to me to close the curtain between their beds so he could rest without having to watch another episode of The Price is Right. The family room, my little work haven, was just down the hall. I started noticing who used it regularly: a woman in her 50s who crocheted by the window while waiting for her mother's therapy sessions to finish. A young man who sat in the corner reading a stack of books, only looking up to check his phone every hour or so, and occasionally a dad who brought his two small kids to visit their grandmother. The kids would sit on the floor, coloring while the dad tried to keep them from knocking over the coffee machine. We'd nod at each other in passing, exchange small talk, and somehow form an unspoken agreement. We all knew this was our space. We respected each other's time, didn't pry into each other's reasons for being there, and shared the room without issue. That's why the nurse incident had felt so jarring. It broke the invisible trust that this place was ours. In the days after the confrontation, I couldn't help but wonder what those nurses had wanted the room for. Were they looking for a private place to have lunch, to hold a meeting, or maybe just a break from the constant demands of the floor? I wasn't unsympathetic. Nursing is grueling and I knew they needed downtime, but the hospital had its own staff areas. This one had a sign on the door that literally read family room. One afternoon, while I was setting up for a video call, the woman who crocheted every day leaned over from her chair and said, "Heard about what happened the other day? That's not right, you know, this room's supposed to be ours." She said it matter-of-factly, but there was a firmness in her tone. I smiled and nodded, appreciating her solidarity. A few days later, I learned that the administrative woman who had defended me had apparently had a discussion with the nursing staff. Whatever was said must have been effective, because from then on, nurses would pass the room, glance inside, and keep walking without a word. A couple of them even started greeting me in the hall, almost as if to prove there were no hard feelings. Meanwhile, my routine became more structured. Mornings were for checking on Dad, making sure his breakfast trays had more than just a tiny cup of applesauce. Afternoons were for work in the family room, with occasional trips back to his room if he needed help adjusting his blankets or figuring out the TV remote. Evenings were my favorite, when visiting hours allowed me to just sit with him, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence. Still, the incident lingered in the back of my mind, not because of the confrontation itself, but because it made me hyper-aware of how fragile these little safe spaces can be. One person's bad day or one misunderstanding could easily shatter the sense of stability that families cling to in these environments. And in a place where emotions were already running high, that stability was worth guarding. By the end of the second week, I'd started to notice something else. The family room wasn't just a place to work or wait. It had its own quiet stories, its own cast of characters, and every so often those stories would collide in unexpected ways. By the time I'd settled into my second week in the rehab unit, the family room had become more than just a makeshift office. It was a small ecosystem, a neutral zone where people carried the weight of their personal battles in silence. I started recognizing patterns. The woman with the crochet projects always claimed the chair by the window. The young man with the books rotated between two seats depending on the light, and me. I had my little desk in the corner, which everyone seemed to agree was mine, even though no one had ever said it out loud. The thing about hospital family rooms is that they hold more than people, they hold stories. Some came out in casual conversation, others you had to piece together from the fragments people let slip. There was one afternoon when the crocheting woman, her name was Linda, put down her hook mid-stitch and stared out the window. Without looking at me, she asked, "Do you ever get used to the smell of this place?" I chuckled softly and told her I didn't think so. Then she started talking, her voice barely above a whisper, about how her mother had been here for weeks after a stroke. "Every day I come in, I think maybe she'll remember my name today," and some days she does. Other days, she looks at me like I'm a stranger on the bus. She paused, then picked up her hook again. "That's why I crochet, gives my hands something to do while my heart tries not to break." Another day, the young man with the books, Evan, looked up from his reading and asked if I could watch his things for a few minutes. When he came back, he sighed and said his father was refusing physical therapy again. "It's like he's given up," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I keep thinking if I read to him or bring him his favorite music, it'll help. But some days nothing gets through." I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the same kind I'd seen in my own reflection lately. Then there were moments that felt almost absurd in their normalcy. Like the time a father brought in his two kids, one with a juice box, the other clutching a stuffed rabbit, and they started a full-on giggle war on the floor while waiting to see their grandmother. Their laughter filled the room, cutting through the heaviness that usually hung in the air. Even Linda smiled, which I'd learned was a rare sight. These interactions were fleeting, but they built a quiet bond between us. We didn't pry into each other's lives outside these walls, but in that room, we were allies, sharing the unspoken understanding that we were all holding vigil for someone we loved. The nurse incident still lingered in my mind, but now it took on a different meaning. It wasn't just about my right to use the room, it was about protecting a fragile little sanctuary that gave people like Linda and Evan, and even those giggling kids, a place to exhale. We weren't just killing time there, we were holding ourselves together. Sometimes, late in the afternoon when the room was empty, I'd imagine what it must look like from the outside. Just a handful of chairs, a desk, a TV. But for us, it was a lifeboat in a sea of uncertainty. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how quickly that could be taken away if someone decided our presence was inconvenient. So I stayed. I claimed my desk every morning not out of stubbornness but as a quiet act of defiance. A reminder to myself and maybe to the hospital staff that families mattered here, that we weren't just visitors but part of the process, part of the fight. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it happened, the day I realized that my earlier clash with those nurses hadn't just been about me. I was in the family room midway through answering a work email when the door opened and Linda stepped in. She looked different. Usually she moved at her own measured pace, calm even when her words carried sadness, but now she seemed rattled. She had her crochet bag slung over one shoulder and was clutching a styrofoam cup of coffee like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Everything okay?" I asked, pulling my headphones down. She hesitated, then sat heavily in the chair by the window. "Not really," she said. "Some nurse told me I couldn't sit in here right now because they needed the room for a meeting. She said to go wait in the lobby." I blinked, the irritation rising instantly. "The lobby, that's halfway across the building." She gave a bitter laugh. "Exactly, and it's full of people coughing, kids running around, and that vending machine that sounds like it's dying." I told her this room was for family members, but she just waved her hand and told me to be flexible. Something in me snapped, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in that quiet, steel-edged way where you know you're not going to let something slide. I stood up and said, "Stay here, I'll handle it." When I stepped into the hallway, I spotted two nurses near the station, one of them flipping through a clipboard. I approached, polite but firm. "Excuse me, are you the ones trying to use the family room for a meeting?" The clipboard nurse looked up, mildly surprised. "Yes, we just need it for a little while." I shook my head. "Then you'll need to find another room. That space is for family members. Linda is waiting for her mom to get out of therapy and she has every right to be there." She started to protest, but I cut her off, not angrily but with the kind of controlled voice that leaves no room for argument. "We've been through this before. Hospital administration has already made it clear. Family members have priority. You can use the staff lounge, the conference room, or any number of other spaces in this building. But you can't just push people out because it's convenient." Her mouth tightened, but she didn't argue. The other nurse gave her a sideways glance, then mumbled something about checking the conference room's schedule. They walked away without another word. When I returned to the family room, Linda was still sitting there, her coffee untouched. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," I replied, sitting back down at my desk. "If we don't stand our ground, they'll just keep trying." She gave me a long look, and for the first time since I'd met her, her eyes softened into something like gratitude. "Well," she said, picking up her crochet hook, "I'm glad you're here." From that day on, something shifted. The family room became less of a shared neutral zone and more of a guarded territory. Not hostile, never hostile, but protected. We all seemed more aware of each other, more ready to quietly back each other up if someone from staff tried to move us along. And oddly enough, that small act of defiance, telling a couple of nurses to find another space, made the room feel even warmer, even safer. Because it wasn't just about chairs and tables, it was about dignity, about having a place to be while you waited, worried, and hoped. It was, in a way, the only thing in the hospital that was truly ours. The morning of my dad's discharge didn't feel real. For weeks, my days had revolved around the rhythm of the rehab unit, the early check-ins, the steady hours in my corner desk, the quiet evenings in his room. I had gotten used to the echo of footsteps in the hallway, the faint clatter of meal carts, the distant chime of the elevator. Now, knowing it was the last time I'd walk into the family room, I felt a strange pull in my chest. I arrived earlier than usual. My dad's discharge paperwork wasn't until the afternoon, but I wanted one last day in my little corner. The desk was exactly as I'd left it the evening before. A stack of sticky notes, my coffee thermos, and the faint outline of my laptop's base imprinted into the wood. I ran my fingers along the edge of the desk as if committing its texture to memory. Linda was already there, sitting by the window with her crochet work. She looked up and smiled. "Big day." I nodded. "Yeah, Dad's going home." "That's wonderful," she said, but her eyes carried that complex mix of emotions you only understand when you've been here. A joy for someone else's good news, paired with the quiet ache of knowing your own journey isn't ending today. Evan came in later balancing a paper bag of snacks. "Heard you're leaving," he said. "Guess I'll have to guard your spot now." I laughed, but there was a lump in my throat. "You better, don't let anyone take it without a fight." As the morning went on, the room filled with its usual quiet hum, Linda's hook clicking through yarn, Evan flipping pages, the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. But there was also something different. Every so often, one of us would glance at the others, almost as if making sure we were still there. The room had been our little refuge, and even though we'd all come here for different reasons, we'd ended up part of the same unspoken pact. This space was for us, and we would protect it. At around noon, I stepped out to check on Dad. He was sitting in his chair, dressed and ready, a little more alert than he'd been in days. "They say I'm good to go," he told me with a small smile. I told him I'd just finish up in the family room and be back to help with the paperwork. When I returned to gather my things, the room was empty. Just me, the desk, and the muted afternoon light slanting through the blinds. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. It struck me then how much had happened within these walls, conversations that carried hope, fear, grief, and laughter in equal measure. And how something as simple as a shared room could become the heartbeat of an experience you didn't choose but had to survive. I slung my bag over my shoulder and took one last look. "Thank you," I whispered, not to the furniture but to the space itself and maybe to the people who'd shared it with me. As I walked out, I saw Linda in the hallway, heading toward the room with a fresh ball of yarn in her hands. "Don't be a stranger," she said. "Same to you," I replied. And I meant it, even though I knew we'd probably never see each other again. That's the nature of hospital friendships, they're forged quickly, deeply, and often end without warning. Minutes later, I was wheeling my dad toward the elevator. The family room disappeared from view, swallowed by the bend of the corridor. But the feeling of it, the safety, the quiet solidarity stayed with me. And as the elevator doors closed, I realized something. I'd walked into that hospital thinking I was there only for my dad. But somewhere along the way, I'd also been there for strangers, and they, in their own quiet ways, had been there for me.